Today I am at the African Union AU Net for Peace, as well as the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation Youth Continental Training for Leadership on Transitional Justice Peacebuilding in Africa. And this particular conference seeks to understand how to empower and bring together youth from all over Africa. I'm talking Cape to Cairo, on the significance of having young people participate and spearhead transitional justice processes in their contextual communities and countries. Today is the first day of the group program. We had Professor Cheryl Hendricks take us off and start the program, as well as a keynote from Ambassador Akok Manyuwat from the AU Commission, as well as Dr. Pakamisa, Deputy Director from DERCO. It is the first day. Of course, things are kicking off, but I am sure it's going to be an impactful and insightful program ahead. I will see you on the next one. Stay in conversation in collaboration with the Youth Organization for Research, Justice and Advocacy. Now, how did we get here? That's always the question. 30 plus years into South Africa's democracy, where freedom is still very much a relative concept. And yes, in this insert, I attended the African Union Commission Department for Political Affairs, Peace and Security in partnership with AU Network of Think Tanks for Peace, Net for Peace, as well as the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, Continental Youth Leadership Training on Transitional Justice, Reconciliation and Peace Building in Africa, bringing together some of the most inspirational young people doing amazing work in transitional justice and peace building and post-conflict reconstruction. Quite the mindful program, and definitely did not disappoint, both in terms of programming and the delegation and the participation. But before I get into the itinerary and what everything entailed, the hands that you saw was just Mama Bear reporting for breakfast and bus duty. Yes, I'm just making sure that I do not miss that bus, because I tend to take a whole lot of videos and dilly-dally, and so she was not having me miss this particular conversation. But also, I think, I've been taking the public transport system for forever. And I think, the public transportation system is really a good indicator of what the state of affairs of one's country is. And I meet a lot of young people, and I've heard some really interesting stories on the bus, right? And it just tells you exactly what's happening, who's using it, how are they using it, how tapped into that market are they as young people. And I think, even that horrendous incident of Mpunyamo resulting in the loss of the young man Mtokozisi's life, right, where he just started his journey and work as an e-hailing driver and callously lost his way in that manner because of the tensions of the dangerous tensions that exist within the public transport system that young people are being exposed to now as they try to find some form of mobility and development for their families, right? And so I think it's a really important conversation that brings to forth a lot of elements on post-conflict reconstruction in the country. And so these are just some of my thoughts as I stepped in, as exhausted as I was, but you think a lot as you enter these conversations, and also very exhausted. It's like a 4 to 5 hour commute on the bus, and really looking forward to it. But also, as one of the key informant interviewees that I was speaking to earlier said, they said, Musa, I'm just tired. I am just so tired. This general sense of fatigue that we all feel as young people in this country, trying to make sense of both mobility and belonging in so many different elements. And I think that is also, the crux of what transitional justice looks like. Reconciliation and conflict resolution, dealing with all these very conflicting elements of what peace brings out in a society and individuals. In Bagamahau, Travel Mercies got us to our destinations safe and sound, and we were able to check in both with institutions and ourselves because, and I'm sure you can imagine that topics of transitional justice really, takes a minute for one to just prepare one's mind around that, whether you're talking peace building, post-conflict reconstruction, reconciliation. Those are topics that are close to our homes and hearts and in our lived experiences, but also Two, and I kid you not, the delegation list was incredibly inspiring, filled with young people doing extraordinary things, both in the smallest ways that they can in making sense of what peace means in their communities, but also in extraordinary ways. And I'm talking representatives from the African Youth Ambassador for Peace from two specific regions, for West Africa, Madame Simone Diouf, as well as North Africa, Mr. Abjalil Arif. And so it really was a moment to just take cognizance of the greatness within the room, but also just the power of what dialogue and how dialogue can also inspire action, no matter how great or how small. And so, with the venue set and the delegates ready, it was time to start the program. And the program began with a moment of silence and a candle lighting to honor the lives and the sacrifices that have been made in the course of the conflict and atrocities that we will be discussing today and throughout the workshop. You see, it's not just conflict or atrocities as we like to define, but these are losses that can be named, but also in many ways unnamed or understood by the mechanisms that we're discussing. What kind of reconciliation are we expecting to build in the backdrop of this conflict? But most importantly, what does peace look like when there's so much loss? The moment was then followed by Sir Felicity Harrison from the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation.
Many different places. We've all got things that are going on in our lives, and I would like us to just bring ourselves into the room for the next few days to be present to ourselves, but also to be present to others, so that we can get the most out of our time together.
The IJR is a Pan-African think tank with 25 years of experience in building just, inclusive, democratic and peaceful societies across Africa.
These historic Continental Youth Leadership Training on Transitional Justice and Reconciliation. The development and conceptualization of this training, as many of you may know, was inspired by South Africa's unique history of resilience, healing, and reconciliation. As such, we gather here not only to build our skills, but to also reflect on the practical lessons that we can take back with us from this training.
South Africa elected its first democratic president, Mr. Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela. This watershed movement, shared all over the world, was no small feat. There was a great deal of behind-the-scenes work that took many difficult years of negotiation and even bloodshed.
And that's when, during the break, we just had to share the intro that we made at the beginning, sharing Professor Cheryl Hendricks' opening remarks, Dr. Phakamisa Siotola's opening remarks, as well as the welcoming remarks by Ambassador Akok Manyuwat from the African Union Commission, the head of Mediation and Dialogue Division. And with that in mind, Professor Cheryl Hendricks then intentionally guided us through what the objectives of the training and the community will be throughout the workshop.
And of the other countries who are going through TJ processes. We are to know more about transitional justice and examine its strengths, but also its weaknesses and its challenges of implementation. Trust building and social cohesion, these are words we throw about all the time. How do we actually promote social cohesion in a very fractured and divided society?
And I believe we all appreciated it. The intentional way in which all the conversations were brought through to our respective realities, and how we were encouraged to say, so what does this mean to you? And I think it just made the conversations even richer. So as a training that was particularly focused on the experiences in Africa and understanding what peace building and reconciliation looks like in policy and practice, the conversation naturally led us back to the African Union Transitional Justice Policy that was passed in 2019 and is a soft law document, but in many ways is so important towards us understanding what peace and reconciliation and transitional justice can look like as we look towards Agenda 2063. The conversation was led by Mr. Osani Odu from the African Union Commission, Department for Political Affairs, Peace and Security.
By way of an overview, we're going to talk about the introduction to the AUTJP definitions, objectives, and the rest. And then we consider the principles of the
Now, sequencing, peace versus justice. Which should come first? This is very important.
Yes.
In the Western context, crime are more individual. You commit a crime, it is yours. Even your own child, your own wife can testify against you. In Africa, we are more communal.
Correct.
But sequencing is it if you decide to go for peace first to take roots,
Correct.
then later on you come for justice. Is justice denied or justice delayed?
To what extent will this then complement those frameworks at national level, especially at accountability level, making sure that the state is living up to
The conversation ignited much conversation on how the African Union Transitional Justice Policy in its indicative elements can be an incredibly insightful tool for shaping what transitional justice and peace building looks like in Africa today. Think of it as a decolonial or contextual approach to peace building and reconstruction in Africa, where the AUTJP can provide important indicative elements of how to shape peace and reconciliation in Africa today, not just for today, but for future generations. The conversation was then followed by a presentation by Professor Timuriti, the head of Peacebuilding Intervention at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. And if I could just take away one very important message that he has for all of us, no matter where we are, is that our time is now. Is that there is no longer any time to second guess ourselves. It is time to understand that as a continent with one of the youngest populations in the world, that indeed we have to take action and ask the hard questions.
Do you use to build and move forward as South Africans? And I think that's why to this day many South Africans don't know that they're wounded and and that they need the healing. That's why to this day when they see a huge police vehicle walk in the townships, you can still sense the trauma, right? You can still sense it in our hospitals. And so I think that hierarchy right there is one of the reasons why South Africans cannot resonate with transitional justice, but is what makes intergenerational justice in this country so hard to figure out. Thank you.
And that was definitely not all there was to day one. It was so insightful, really, challenging in the best ways possible. But I had to call it a night, and then day two began, and we had a really important program on AI and misinformation by the Institute of Justice and Reconciliation, where we spoke about how important it is to be intentional about the media and messaging when we do the work that we do, especially as young people. The conversation was then also followed by a panel still led by the African Union Commission, with representatives from Liberia, the Gambia, Mozambique, and Sierra Leone talking about their experiences in the work that they do and how peace building shows up in that particular context. And I'm fast forwarding through many other important conversations we had on dialogue and trust building, but it also then was followed by an important conversation on leadership and group work, where we all had to define and understand what leadership is, but most importantly, how one builds trust in dialogue.
Leader, and people are not going to follow you because they're going to realize that you're asking them to be vulnerable, them to do the work, when you're actually not doing it yourself.
And these are just some of the communal collections on the values that the young leaders believe all practitioners have to hold as they embark on this impactful and important work of transitional justice. And of course, the workshop then ended with a graduation and a sincere gratitude to all the delegates, not just for the workshop, but also for the daily strides that they take in peace building within their communities and the vision they all individually have for their countries as well as the continent.
Miss Catherine Charles Modi Vitaliano. Followed by Miss by Mr. Hieronymus Peter. It is in your hands. We are entrusting this continent to you to build the future for us and our children and grandchildren.
And that concluded an incredibly inspiring graduation. But the most important message here is understanding the significance of intergenerational justice, as echoed by Professor Cheryl Hendricks. The future does indeed belong to us, and ensuring that we build a sustainable and peaceful one for ourselves and future generations. The graduation was inspiring. Congratulations to all the delegates and gratitude for sharing so much of your insight, of yourselves, of your experiences. And I look forward to seeing all the great things that you will continue doing within your respective communities, but most importantly, for the continent. The last day of the study tour was a visit to key memorial sites in Johannesburg of South Africa, intended to perhaps show the delegates what the state of transitional justice is when we're talking about the significance of memory as a form of justice and how far that process has gone. And so at this particular point in time, there was an intentional guiding on the kinds of emotions and experiences that a visit to a memorial site can invoke, and that the program and process anticipates and is prepared to support delegates throughout. This was very important. And with the trauma-informed response reinforced for the delegates by the organizers, it was time to be safely on our way. And Joburg traffic was definitely participating, because before we knew it, we were at our first stop, Constitution Hill. Definitely an important or key site in both our history, but also our contemporary. A lot of matters come here for deliberation, speaking about or echoing important values that were agreed upon in our constitution, most certainly or importantly being that of Ubuntu, of understanding that humanity is at the end of whatever law and society that we are trying to build. And if you go to the Constitutional Court, just right in front of the Constitutional Court is another invocation and harsh question to our democracy 30 years later, a campaign that has been continuing and led by Khulumani Galela in advocacy for reparations. And not just that, they remain steadfast in ensuring or asking important questions on the unfinished business of this country. And so, whilst we were taking all of that information in, it was time to move on to our first site with our guide, Mr. Pius, and we went all the way back in history to colonial time, where we discussed the establishment or creation of Gauteng through its mines and its economic activity, and thereafter through various sites, and including, the first jail, the men's jail, the women's jail. We ended up at the Constitutional Court and getting a really rich history of what the Constitutional Court is about and the architecture and of course the role that it plays today. Before we knew it, it was time to pack up, because time really does fly when you are asking those difficult questions, and the conversations were definitely flowing in that area. And so we had to move on to our second spot, and that is our memorial site, the Hector Peterson Museum and Memorial Site. My first time coming to the Hector Peterson Museum, and I don't think I was ready. I think also coming from South Africa and seeing how this history has impacted both grandparents, my parents, but also myself, I thought this part of the tour, especially for a first time, was so real. But of course, we learned really important information on who Hector Zolile Peterson was, his family, but most importantly, the many lives that were lost from 1976, right? You cannot take images throughout the museum, but you have to get there. And as young people, we have to show up and start conscientizing and educating ourselves about what youth agency and activism can do, but also whether or how we can resonate or bring those values into our lives to incite the agency that we so need. And of course, Vilakazi Street, no tour is complete without going through Vilakazi Street. And thereafter, we had to go to the Apartheid Museum. Again, another element that I was mentally not ready for, particularly when they give us these tokens, these classification tokens that tell us who we are going to be for the purpose of the first, part of the tour, and having to exit through or enter through different sites, one for blacks and one for whites. Of course, somehow also eerily, traumatizing. So I could only imagine what it must have been living under this time. And there was a sense of heaviness that came over, especially because I got a chance to see what a dompas looks like. My grandparents had them. And so I saw these documents in the house, and the history is just too present. And having to walk through those halls and having to get to the appeal section, history is not as far as we think that it is. And there you see those who are classified as white get to take the upper road. And we all meet at the end to sort of symbolize that at the end we all meet, humanity comes together, whether we're classified or not. They're important elements that bring us together as a society. And it's a long, long walk. And the imagery was incredibly powerful in that regard, having to see images of Advocate George Bezos as well. And of course the hippo, right? How many of us in the townships remember this, and it's still sort of an active figure within the South African Police Service. So this part of the tour was also, unfortunately, way too real for me. I was overloaded. I was, for lack of a better word, yes, triggered. Yes, a lot of emotions I wasn't ready to have, no matter the prep work that I did. But I was overall incredibly grateful. I was incredibly grateful for the experience, and I needed a moment to also just come back to oneself and deal, because oftentimes we don't allow ourselves as young people to acknowledge that the pain is real and it's present and it's not over. We still have to go back to it. And I think that's where the heaviness for me came in, and day 3 was very heavy for me. Nevertheless, the venue was incredibly beautiful, really good artistry all over the place, and I could not have asked for a better program to remind me that indeed the time is now, and that we don't have to do it alone. There's a whole network of people, there's a whole community ready to support and also build towards the advancement of peace and reconciliation in Africa. It's time to go home, and it was an incredibly amazing tour. So grateful, and congratulations to the organizers. And thank you so much for tuning in. And I will see you on the next one. Bye-bye.